carry without ever questioning it. The belief that if you are loyal enough, patient enough, generous enough, your friendships will naturally last. That closeness is something you earn by enduring, by giving, by staying silent when something feels wrong. But if you slow down and look honestly at your own life, you already know this isn't true. Think of a moment you rarely talk about. It's late. Your phone is in your hand. You've typed a message, erased it, typed it again. You don't want to sound dramatic. You don't want to be a burden. And yet something inside you needs to be seen. So you send it. You admit quietly that you're not okay, that you need someone. Then you wait. The screen lights up. The typing dots appear, then vanish. Minutes stretch longer than they should. Eventually, the phone goes dark, and in that silence, something lands deeper than the original pain. Not anger, not shock, just a hollow realization that whispers, maybe I mattered less than I thought. Most people turn that moment inward. They assume they asked for too much. They replay past conversations, scanning for the mistake that explains the distance. They start shaping stories about themselves. Maybe I'm too intense. Maybe I depend on people too much. Maybe this is just who I am. But there is another explanation, one we're rarely taught to consider, that silence is not always about your worth. Often, it's about balance. Carl Jung observed that relationships are living systems, shaped by forces we don't consciously track. Beneath politeness and shared history, there are unconscious patterns at work. Patterns of giving and receiving, of effort and withdrawal. And when those patterns drift too far out of balance, the relationship doesn't usually collapse. It fades, quietly, slowly, almost politely. Friendships don't survive on intention alone. They survive on exchange, on a rhythm that moves back and forth even when no one is keeping score. Time flows, attention flows, care flows. And when that flow becomes one-directional, something inside the bond begins to dry up. This is where many people resist the truth because it sounds cold at first, but it isn't. It's human. Friendships are transactional, not in a calculating or cruel way, not with tallies or conditions, but in the most psychological sense. Energy is exchanged. Emotional labor is exchanged. Presence is exchanged. When that exchange is alive, friendship feels natural. You don't rehearse messages. You don't wonder where you stand. You show up and you are met. When the exchange becomes uneven, your body notices before your mind does. You feel drained after conversations. You feel a low-level resentment you can't quite justify. You hesitate before reaching out. The persona you wear as the good friend starts to feel heavy. That's not selfishness. That's awareness trying to surface. Jung taught that when we ignore what we feel, it doesn't disappear. It moves into the shadow, and there it begins to shape our behavior indirectly. Resentment builds. Withdrawal happens quietly. Distance grows without explanation. And one day, both people are confused about what went wrong. This often begins with care. Someone you love is overwhelmed. Their life feels like it's falling apart. And because you are attentive, because you are emotionally capable, you listen. You stay longer than you plan. You absorb their stress. You help them make sense of their chaos. At first, it feels meaningful. Being needed can feel like being chosen. So you keep showing up, again and again. Their crises repeat, and you remain steady. You tell yourself this is what friendship looks like. Then one day you try to share something of your own. Not dramatically, just honestly. You mention the weight you've been carrying, and suddenly the energy shifts. The response is shorter, distracted, delayed. Your vulnerability feels like an interruption rather than a welcome exchange. You don't confront it. You rationalize it. They're busy. Everyone goes through phases. And so you keep listening. You keep giving. But something subtle changes inside you. You begin to feel more like an emotional utility than a friend. Like your role is to hold, absorb, regulate, but not to be held yourself. You may not name it yet, but your psyche does. And slowly, resentment takes root in the shadow. This is emotional debt, not because helping is wrong, but because help without reciprocity drains instead of connecting. You are no longer sharing support, you are exporting it. The danger is that this erosion doesn't look dramatic enough to address. There is no betrayal, no clear villain, just a gradual thinning of closeness. Eventually, you stop sharing without realizing you've decided to. You become quieter, more distant. And when you finally pull back, the other person feels surprised. From their perspective, you changed. From yours, you finally stopped overgiving. A friendship where only one person consistently empties themselves is not intimacy. It is imbalance disguised as loyalty. And once you see that pattern, you start noticing another version of it. You give in concrete ways: time, help, resources. You do it freely because you don't want to be the kind of person who keeps score. But when nothing ever circles back, not even acknowledgement, trust erodes quietly. Your body senses it long before your mind accepts it. Unreturned generosity leaves residue, an invisible weight that changes how you show up. You hesitate. You give less. You protect yourself without announcing why. From the outside, it looks like distance. From the inside, it feels like disappointment. This is where many friendships begin to rot quietly. Not from conflict, but from imbalance left unnamed. And the moment you recognize that pattern in your own life, something important begins. Not suspicion, not bitterness, but clarity. Because once you understand the unseen exchanges shaping your relationships, you stop blaming yourself for dynamics that were never meant to last unchanged. Most friendships don't end with a clear rupture. There's rarely a final argument or a moment you can point to and say, "This is where it broke." Instead, they thin out. Replies take longer. Plans stay tentative. Conversations remain polite but never quite reach the place they used to. One day you realize weeks have passed since you last felt truly connected, and you can't explain how the distance crept in. It's easy to call this life: busy schedules, changing priorities, growing up. And those things are real, but they are not the full story. Beneath them, quieter forces are shaping who stays close and who drifts away. Jung believed that what we don't consciously examine tends to repeat itself unconsciously. And in friendships, the most unexamined patterns often involve time, emotional depth, and follow-through. These are subtle currencies. They don't feel dramatic, but over time they decide whether a relationship deepens or slowly hollows out. One of the most socially rewarded imbalances begins with availability. Being available feels like care. You respond quickly. You rearrange your plans. You show up even when you're tired, even when your own life is asking for attention. Saying yes feels easier than explaining no. And at first it feels good. You're included, wanted, part of something. But availability, when it becomes a pattern rather than a choice, quietly teaches others how to value your time. When you're always the one who can adjust, your time stops feeling precious. Not because people intend to take advantage of you, but because repetition shapes expectation. Slowly, your calendar fills with other people's needs. Your own quiet gets postponed. The space you need to recharge shrinks. Invitations that once felt like connection begin to feel like obligation. And still, you keep saying yes, because somewhere inside, you fear what might happen if you stop. Then one day you do stop. You decline. You ask for space. And suddenly the reaction feels disproportionate. You're seen as distant, changed, less available than before. From the outside, it looks like you pulled away. From the inside, it feels like you finally noticed the imbalance. Time is not just logistics, it's a psychological signal. When it flows both ways, friendship feels energizing. When it consistently flows in one direction, burnout follows. The people who truly value you don't disappear when you stop being endlessly flexible. They adapt. They initiate. They meet you halfway. The ones who vanish were never attached to you as a person. They were attached to your convenience. Another quiet erosion happens not through time, but through depth. Not every friendship is meant to hold your deepest fears or questions, but something painful happens when you offer depth repeatedly and it's never returned. You share something real, not to overwhelm, just to be honest. And the response skims the surface. A joke, a quick agreement, a topic change. Nothing overtly unkind, just empty. You tell yourself they're uncomfortable with emotions. You lower your expectations. You keep things light. But each time you almost share and decide not to, something tightens inside you. This is how loneliness forms inside connection. Emotional depth is another form of exchange. When one person risks vulnerability and the other consistently avoids it, the imbalance grows. One person enters uncertainty, the other stays protected. Over time, the one who risks learns to retreat. Not loudly, quietly. The relationship becomes functional but hollow. Jung saw this as a clash between the persona and the deeper self. The persona keeps things pleasant, socially acceptable, easy to manage. The deeper self longs for authenticity, for being met where you actually are. When a friendship lives only at the level of persona, it can survive for a while, but it cannot nourish you. Closeness requires mutual courage. If someone repeatedly deflects depth, it doesn't mean they are bad. It often means they are protecting parts of themselves they don't yet know how to face. But when you keep offering your inner world to someone who can't hold it, you begin to feel exposed rather than supported. So you adapt. You stop initiating those conversations. You mirror their level. You save your depth for elsewhere, or sometimes for no one at all. And the friendship feels different, though nothing obvious has changed. Then there is another pattern that cuts even deeper because it disrupts trust. You show up when it matters, a crisis, a turning point. You give your energy freely because the moment feels important. They thank you. They seem grateful. And then, after the storm passes, the connection evaporates. No check-in, no return gesture, just silence until the next need arises. This creates a strange emotional confusion. You don't feel openly disrespected, but you feel forgotten. You wonder if you imagine the closeness. You question whether expecting anything afterward makes you selfish. But your nervous system understands something your mind resists. Trust is not built by the help itself. It's built by what happens after. The reaching back. The acknowledgement that the bond matters beyond the crisis. When that follow-through is missing, warmth cools. You begin to guard yourself. You hesitate before helping again. From the outside, it looks like distance. From the inside, it's self-protection. What all of these patterns have in common is not malice, but imbalance left unexamined. Time given without regard for your own limits. Depth offered without being mirrored. Help extended without continuity. None of these make you weak. They make you generous. But generosity without awareness slowly empties you. And here is a question for you to reflect on now. Think about your friendships as they are today. Which ones leave you feeling nourished? Which ones leave you quietly depleted? Take a moment and share your experience in the comments. What patterns have you noticed, and how have they shaped the way you show up for others? Observing yourself through reflection is not just helpful, it's the first step toward understanding the invisible exchanges shaping your relationships. The moment you start noticing these patterns, something subtle begins to shift inside you. You begin to understand that most friendships don't end suddenly. They fade through small, almost invisible exchanges. Replies take longer. Invitations are declined politely but consistently. Conversations skim the surface rather than exploring depth. Slowly, the rhythm of the relationship changes, and your body senses it before your mind can name it. You may find yourself hesitating to reach out, not because you no longer care, but because your energy has limits, and the imbalance has been quietly shaping your behavior. You start to protect yourself unconsciously, holding back the parts of you that were once freely shared. It isn't selfishness. It's the psyche signaling that something fundamental is off balance. Jung taught that the shadow, the parts of ourselves we suppress, often grows in these unacknowledged spaces. Resentment, fatigue, and quiet withdrawal are its early manifestations. When we ignore our feelings of imbalance, they move into the shadow, influencing our behavior indirectly. Without conscious recognition, the shadow dictates when we give, when we retreat, and when we finally stop engaging. Care often begins naturally. You show up for friends during moments of crisis, you listen, you absorb their stress, you offer support without hesitation. At first, this feels meaningful. Being needed feels like being valued, and you tell yourself that this is what friendship looks like: constant presence, consistent giving. But one day when you attempt to share your own struggles, the energy shifts. Responses are shorter, distracted, or delayed. Your vulnerability feels like an interruption rather than an exchange. You rationalize, they're busy. Life gets in the way. And so you continue giving, staying quiet about your own needs. Slowly, the emotional balance shifts and the shadow begins to accumulate. This is emotional debt, not because giving is wrong, but because giving without reciprocation drains rather than connects. You are no longer sharing support, you are exporting it. Over time, the quiet erosion becomes unmistakable. You become distant, not because you've changed fundamentally, but because your psyche is preserving what remains whole. Another subtle form of imbalance comes from depth. You may consistently risk emotional exposure, sharing your fears, uncertainties, or longings. And if those moments are never met with reciprocity, you learn to adapt. You mirror the other person's level. You stop initiating meaningful conversations. The relationship survives, but it becomes functional, hollow, devoid of the authentic energy it once held. When the persona dominates, when the friendship operates primarily at the surface, authentic connection suffers. The persona maintains politeness, manages impressions, and avoids discomfort. Meanwhile, the deeper self longs for acknowledgement and resonance. The longer the imbalance continues, the more your inner self retreats, while your outer self continues performing the role expected of you. At some point, you may start noticing another form of imbalance. Crises followed by silence. You show up during emergencies. You offer help freely. Gratitude may be expressed, but afterward, nothing circulates back. No check-ins, no return gestures, just absence until the next crisis arises. Your nervous system recognizes this absence before your mind fully processes it. Trust isn't built solely by your help in the moment. It's reinforced by follow-through, acknowledgement, and the shared rhythm of giving and receiving. When that rhythm is broken, subtle withdrawal and guardedness grow within you. From the outside, it may appear that you are pulling away. From the inside, it is self-preservation. Emotional patterns, when left unexamined, accumulate into fatigue, disappointment, and the quiet reshaping of your engagement and friendships. Generosity, when unreciprocated, slowly empties you. And this is often where the first conscious realizations emerge. Why am I carrying so much alone? Why does it feel like I am always giving more than I receive? Awareness of these patterns is transformative. You start to observe not only what you give, but what you are willing to accept. You notice the subtle signs of imbalance, hesitation before messaging, lingering resentment, exhaustion after interactions. These signals are not flaws. They are the psyche communicating its need for equilibrium. And as this awareness grows, you begin to notice which friendships naturally sustain themselves and which are contingent on your overextension. Some connections respond positively when you begin to assert your limits, gradually adjusting to maintain mutual flow. Others resist, subtly expressing discomfort or withdrawal. This distinction is not moral judgment. It is clarity about alignment and compatibility. You may also notice patterns in how generosity is received. Time, attention, emotional energy, and vulnerability are currencies exchanged in relationships. When the flow is reciprocal, connection feels alive. When it becomes one-directional, subtle erosion begins. The more conscious you become of these exchanges, the more you learn to protect your energy while still participating fully in relationships that sustain you. As awareness deepens, you begin to distinguish between imbalance and natural fluctuation. Life inevitably shifts. People get busy, priorities change, but there is a difference between temporary adjustments and persistent patterns that quietly drain you. Seasons of giving and receiving are natural, but when one side consistently carries more, the relationship begins to freeze into a predictable dynamic. One person becomes the container, the other becomes the content. And because these roles feel familiar, they can persist for years without either person consciously choosing them. Early experiences often shape this dynamic. If you learn that being useful keeps you safe or earns approval, you may unconsciously shape friendships around that role. You become the listener, the problem solver, the steady presence. It feels noble. It feels socially rewarded. But beneath that role lies a quieter need, the desire to be met without performing, to be supported simply for who you are. When that need is ignored, fatigue, cynicism, and withdrawal slowly emerge. At some point, you may notice a profound disconnect. You are surrounded by people, yet you feel unseen, not because you are invisible, but because the version of you that is visible is incomplete. Jung warned that over-identifying with a role diminishes access to your deeper self. The helper suppresses personal need. The strong one hides vulnerability. The calm one swallows anger. Friendships formed around these roles struggle when the person begins to shift. Growth often feels like loss. As you become more honest about your limits, some friendships strain. Not because you did anything wrong, but because the bond depended on an earlier version of you, one that overfunctioned, accommodated endlessly, and silently absorbed more than it could safely hold. Boundaries disrupt the unspoken agreements of imbalance. Some friends adjust, some retreat. This is not cruelty, it is coherence, clarity, and alignment. Discernment becomes essential. A friend who values you will notice your changes, stumble, and eventually adjust. A friend who valued only the role you played may feel threatened. Your boundaries feel like rejection, not because you rejected them, but because the dynamic no longer serves the same function. Individuation, the process of becoming fully yourself, inevitably reshapes your relationships. Some deepen, others dissolve. Both outcomes are honest. Both are necessary. At this stage, restraint becomes a subtle tool of growth. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-functioning. You stop rushing to fill the silence. You begin noticing who reaches back, who mirrors your energy, who respects the balance of giving and receiving. This is uncomfortable at first because it disrupts familiar patterns. Yet discomfort signals growth. It signals alignment with your authentic self. Friendship begins to breathe again. It contracts and expands. Sometimes you lean, sometimes you are leaned on. When reciprocity is alive, energy circulates. Support flows in both directions without negotiation. You no longer have to shrink your needs to preserve harmony, and conversations carry a natural rhythm rather than a performance. Over time, you may realize that generosity no longer feels exhausting. You speak more directly because you are no longer managing fragile dynamics. You give more freely because you no longer fear depletion. You receive openly because you are no longer ashamed of needing. This is the quiet reward of discernment, the freedom to participate in relationships without self-erasure. Friendship stops being something you maintain through effort and becomes something you participate in through presence. You don't lose kindness, you refine it. You don't lose loyalty, you anchor it in self-respect. And perhaps most importantly, you stop mistaking endurance for depth. The healthiest friendships are not measured by how much you give, but by how fully you can be yourself and still feel held. And now, as you reflect on what you've heard so far, take a moment to pause. Consider your own circle. Which relationships leave you energized? Which leave you drained? Share your thoughts in the comments. What patterns are emerging in your own life? Observing these dynamics is not just reflection, it is an act of consciousness that begins to shift your experience of connection itself. Once you reach this stage of awareness, the quiet transformation begins. You stop chasing balance and start choosing alignment. You no longer scan conversations for signs of reciprocity. You no longer wonder whether you're asking too much. Instead, you notice how you feel after an interaction, energized or depleted, seen or managed, calm or subtly tense. This shift moves you out of analysis and into embodiment. Jung believed the psyche speaks through feeling long before it speaks through language. Your fatigue, irritation, or subtle hesitation are signals, not flaws. When you finally listen, you stop forcing connections that require you to betray yourself. Alignment feels different from effort. Effort asks you to adjust constantly. Alignment asks very little. You speak and you are understood enough. You pause and the space is respected. You don't need to be perfectly articulated to be received. Boundaries become filters rather than walls. They allow what nourishes and slow what drains. They are not punishment or control. They are honesty with your own limits. Setting them may trigger guilt, especially if your value was long tied to availability. But guilt is often the echo of an old identity losing relevance. It does not mean harm, it means you are changing. And change inevitably reshapes relationships. Some friendships respond with curiosity and adaptation. Expectations are named. Roles soften. Mutual respect grows. Others resist or withdraw, not because you are wrong, but because the dynamic depended on your previous overextension. Jung's insight is sharp here. What collapses when you become more whole was never supporting your wholeness to begin with. Letting go is grief, yes, but grief also clears space. By releasing imbalanced bonds, you create room for friendships that are quieter at first, less consuming, but steadier and more real. These connections notice your exhaustion without requiring explanation. They assume loyalty. They respect change. You experience a new kind of safety, the safety of being accepted, not just needed. You begin to show up differently. You speak more directly because you are no longer managing fragile dynamics. You give more freely because you are not afraid of depletion. You receive more openly because you are no longer ashamed of needing. Friendship ceases to be something you maintain through effort and becomes something you participate in through presence. You refine kindness. You anchor loyalty and self-respect. You stop mistaking endurance for depth. Individuation reshapes your relationships. The more fully you inhabit yourself, the more authentic your connections must become. Some bonds deepen, others dissolve. Neither is failure, both are alignment. This clarity allows you to distinguish between friendships that nourish and those that quietly deplete. You stop rehearsing messages. You stop over-explaining boundaries. You stop fearing that being yourself will cost you connection. The friendships that endure this phase are quieter, but deeper. They are reliable. They do not require constant reassurance. Trust has been built through consistency, not intensity. Conflict is addressed rather than absorbed. Repair replaces resentment. Honesty replaces guessing. Connection is no longer about performance, it is participation. And this is the moment of reflection. Take a quiet breath and consider your own friendships. Which connections leave you feeling lighter, and which leave you carrying invisible weight? Which relationships honor your presence, and which quietly demand more than they return? If this video resonated with you, share your experience in the comments. Speak of the patterns you've noticed, the moments of clarity, or the subtle imbalances that have shaped your connections. Engage not just to be heard, but to observe yourself through reflection. Like the video if it helped illuminate something you hadn't noticed before, and subscribe to continue exploring the subtle currents of human connection, self-awareness, and psychological insight. Your voice matters here, not as a statistic, but as part of a conversation about presence, balance, and the friendships that truly sustain you. And as you move forward, remember, connection that asks you to erase pieces of yourself is not connection. It is survival. The friendships that endure are those that allow you to be whole,